It was just after 8 a.m. when Judge Malik Thomas pulled his black Mercedes sedan onto a quiet stretch of highway, headed to a courthouse 2 counties over. He was scheduled to preside over a high-profile corruption trial and had left early to avoid the media frenzy expected outside the city. Malik, always calm and composed, wore a dark navy suit, crisp white shirt and a simple striped tie. His briefcase sat in the passenger seat. His day had barely begun when red and blue lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. Sighing, he pulled over to the shoulder. A patrol car screeched to a stop behind him. The officer approached quickly, hand already resting on his belt. He didn't even ask for license and registration before speaking. Well, the cop said with a smirk. In a bit of a rush this morning, aren't we? Malik looked up slowly. Was I speeding? I asked the questions, the officer snapped. Step out of the vehicle. Malik raised a brow. May I ask what this is about, officer? Step out. Now, the cop barked, clearly enjoying the control. The judge sighed again, not in fear, but disappointment. He calmly unbuckled and stepped out, standing tall and composed. The officer circled the vehicle like he was sizing up a suspect. Nice car, he said sarcastically. Did you rent it for the day? Malik said nothing. He knew better than to escalate. But he was also taking mental notes. Every word. Every action. That's when the officer pulled out a citation book and said, "Let me guess, no idea why I stopped you, huh?" I have a pretty good idea now, Malik replied quietly. The officer froze mid-scribble. Excuse me. Malik reached into his jacket slowly, pulled out a leather wallet, and flipped it open. Inside, a federal badge and judicial identification. The officer's smirk vanished. For a long second, the officer just stared at the ID, as if trying to convince himself it wasn't real. Federal judge. He muttered, the words almost sticking in his throat. Malik didn't blink. Yes. U.S. District Court. Appointed 6 years ago. Currently presiding over the largest corruption case in the state. Which is why I'm on the road this early. The officer's posture shifted immediately. The bravado drained from his face like someone had flipped a switch. He suddenly looked like a kid caught sneaking out past curfew. I didn't realize, the officer stammered. I thought, Malik cut him off, still calm. You thought what? That I was someone you could intimidate because of how I look. Because I drive a nice car. Or because I didn't fit your idea of who belongs behind the wheel of it. The officer's face turned red. Sir, I meant no disrespect. You ordered me out of the vehicle without explanation. You made assumptions. You mocked me. You failed to follow basic protocol. Malik's tone wasn't angry, just firm. Unshakable. It wasn't his first encounter like this, but it might be this officer's last one before a serious complaint. Do you have your body cam on? Malik asked suddenly. The officer nodded hesitantly. Good, Malik said. Then we won't need to argue about what happened here. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small notepad. Name and badge number, he said. The officer hesitated, but the judge didn't need him to speak. Malik had already memorized the number embroidered above his badge and had seen the nameplate, T. Reynolds. Still, the officer answered. Officer Tyler Reynolds. Badge 74892. Malik jotted it down and closed the notepad. I won't be late for court, he said quietly. But you should be prepared for a phone call from Internal Affairs. He turned back toward his car. But before he opened the door, he paused. One more thing, Malik added. You're not the first to make this mistake with me, but you might be the last one I let walk away without a formal report. Reynolds' lips parted as if to apologize again, but Malik didn't wait. He got in the car, started the engine, and pulled off smoothly, leaving a stunned officer standing on the side of the road, still trying to figure out how badly he had just messed up. By the time Malik arrived at the courthouse, the incident was already behind him, at least mentally. He had a full day of proceedings ahead, and he wasn't the type to carry distractions into the courtroom. But not everyone moved on so quickly. Officer Reynolds sat in his patrol car, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring blankly out the windshield. Reality had hit him harder than a brick wall. A federal judge. He had mocked a federal judge. And worse, the interaction was on body cam. Every word. Every smug tone. Every inappropriate command. By noon, his captain called. Reynolds, the voice on the line was tense. "Did you pull over at Judge Malik Thomas this morning?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." "Is it true you ordered him out of the vehicle without cause?" I thought he looked suspicious." "Suspicious," the captain interrupted. "Do you have any idea who you stopped? Or the kind of oversight that office has over ours?" "I didn't know who he was at the time." "Doesn't matter," the captain snapped. "You treated a civilian like a suspect without just cause. And this civilian happens to be one of the most respected federal judges in the country." There was a long pause before the captain added, "He's filing a complaint." Reynolds's stomach twisted. "Am I being suspended?" "We're reviewing the footage. But I'll be honest with you, Reynolds, internal affairs is already involved. And they're not happy." Reynolds leaned back in his seat, face pale. He thought back to the way Malik never raised his voice, never got rattled, just calmly dismantled him with words sharper than any weapon. He hadn't just pulled over a driver that morning. He had pulled over a man who wrote the law others tried to bend. And now the law, his law, was circling back. 2 days later, Officer Reynolds sat in a small, windowless room at the precinct, a copy of his bodycam footage paused on the screen in front of him. Across the table sat 2 internal affairs investigators, neither smiling. One of them, a woman named Director Silva, tapped her pen against a legal pad. "You initiated a traffic stop at 8:14 a.m., she said, eyes scanning the report. "No report of speeding. No broken tail light. No expired registration. Do you want to explain the justification?" Reynolds fidgeted in his seat. "I thought he looked out of place." Silva looked up slowly. "Out of place? What does that mean?" "I mean, it's a remote area. That kind of car isn't usually seen on that road, especially that early." "So," the second investigator, Agent Kwan, leaned forward, "you profile the vehicle. Not a traffic violation." Reynolds didn't respond. Silva pressed play. The room filled with the sound of his own voice, smug, dismissive, barking orders. Then came the shift, Malik Thomas calmly identifying himself. The moment the badge appeared. The stammering. The awkward retreat. Silva paused the video again. "Did you recognize Judge Thomas?" "No. Not at the time." "And if he hadn't revealed who he was?" Reynolds was silent. Agent Kwan leaned back. "That's the problem." Silva looked up again. "You didn't just show poor judgment. You abused your authority. You mocked someone who complied. And the only thing that changed your tone was his title." Reynolds's hands were now clenched in his lap. "Effective immediately," Silva said, sliding a form across the table, "you're placed on administrative leave, pending final disciplinary action." "But," Reynolds began. She cut him off. "Don't speak. Just listen, this wasn't about a judge. It was about how you treat anyone. And that camera caught everything." Reynolds slowly nodded, signing the paper. He had worn the badge for 7 years. But today, it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. And somewhere across town, in a courtroom full of attorneys and cameras, Judge Malik Thomas carried on, never mentioning the traffic stop. Never showing a hint of distraction. Because for men like him, dignity didn't depend on a badge. Later that evening, Judge Malik Thomas sat alone in his office, long after the courthouse had gone quiet. His robe was folded neatly over the back of a leather chair, and the last of the daylight filtered through the tall windows behind him. He stared at the formal complaint document on his desk, and signed. He hadn't yet decided what to do. It wasn't that he doubted the seriousness of what happened. In fact, it had shaken something in him. Not because he was scared, he wasn't. But because if he, a federal judge, could be treated with such casual disrespect, what happened to those without a title? But Malik wasn't driven by anger. He was driven by purpose. His career had always been about justice, not revenge. Just then, his clerk, Elena, knocked gently. "Judge Thomas," she peeked in. "You have a visitor." Malik raised an eyebrow. "At this hour?" She nodded. "It's Officer Reynolds. He's not in uniform." Malik's expression didn't change, but a heavy silence filled the room. "Send him in." Reynolds entered slowly, his eyes downcast, holding his hat in both hands like a schoolboy. "Judge Thomas," he began softly, I know I've already made a mess of things. But I needed to say this face to face." Malik leaned back, giving him space to speak. "I was wrong," Reynolds continued. "There's no excuse for the way I acted. I've replayed it over and over, and the truth is, I saw someone and made assumptions. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I've learned more in the last 48 hours than I did in years of training." Malik studied him carefully. The bravado was gone. The ego had crumbled. "Sit down," Malik said quietly. Reynolds looked surprised, but obeyed. "I haven't filed the complaint yet," Malik said. "And I may still. Not because of how it affected me, but because you wear a badge that gives you power over people who may never get the chance to prove who they are." Reynolds nodded, his voice cracking slightly. "I understand. But here's the difference between punishment and accountability," Malik continued. "Punishment ends the conversation. Accountability starts it." He pushed a file across the desk. "I'm recommending you attend a community judicial outreach program. You'll sit with the very people you serve. Not to lecture. To listen." Reynolds looked down at the folder, stunned. "You're giving me a second chance." "No," Malik said calmly. "You're giving it to yourself." The officer stood slowly, his voice just above a whisper. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he left the room, the door closed gently behind him. And Malik, after a long pause, finally picked up a pen, and didn't sign the complaint. 3 weeks later, Officer Tyler Reynolds sat quietly in a folding chair inside a crowded community center in East Brookside, a part of town he used to patrol but never really knew. Beside him sat a teenage boy who had once been wrongly detained. Across from him, a grandmother shared how her son had lost his job after a baseless citation. A single mother recounted being pulled over 3 times in 1 month for routine checks. No shouting. No finger-pointing. Just stories. Raw. Unfiltered. Human. Reynolds didn't speak much. He listened, really listened, for the first time in years. And with each voice, each experience, he saw his badge differently. Not as a symbol of control, but of responsibility. He had expected the outreach program to be some sort of punishment. Instead, it was something else entirely, a mirror. And what he saw in that mirror was someone who had failed. But also someone who could change. At the final session, a facilitator asked the group, "What's one thing you're walking away with?" Reynolds stood up slowly. "I used to think that the uniform meant I had the answers," he said. "But the truth is, I never asked the right questions. I thought authority came from power, but it comes from trust. And I broke that." He paused, scanning the room. "But someone gave me a second chance. Not just to keep my job, but to earn back what I didn't even know I'd lost." Afterward, he stepped outside and took a long breath. The city moved around him, no longer something to control, but something to understand. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Malik Thomas sat at his bench, gavel in hand. He ruled with the same quiet strength he always had, never raising his voice, never chasing headlines. He didn't need to. He knew that sometimes, justice wasn't about punishment. Sometimes, the most powerful sentence was the opportunity to grow. Months passed. Officer Reynolds returned to duty, but he wasn't the same man who had once barked orders at a calm driver on the side of a highway. His posture was different. His approach softer. He no longer scanned the streets looking for threats. He watched for opportunities to serve. He stopped pulling people over for suspicious behavior. Instead, he talked to them. Learned their names. Asked questions. Word began to spread through the community. People noticed. Some were skeptical, but many saw the shift was real. One afternoon, while directing traffic outside a school zone, a young boy walked up to Reynolds and handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing, stick figures, a cop and a man shaking hands. Above them, written in crayon, were the words, "Thank you for listening." Reynolds smiled and tucked the drawing into his vest pocket, next to his badge. Across town, Judge Malik Thomas received a letter at his chambers. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper inside. "I used to think the worst mistake I ever made was that traffic stop. Now I believe it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Thank you for holding the mirror up, and not slamming the door." Malik folded the letter, placed it in a drawer beside others like it, reminders that justice isn't always about headlines or harsh penalties. Sometimes it's about planting a seed, and trusting it will grow. And somewhere, because of that seed, a boy might grow up knowing officers can change. A judge might know his silence spoke louder than any sentence. And a community might feel just a little more seen. 6 months later, Judge Malik Thomas was invited to speak at a criminal justice reform panel at a local university. The room was packed, students, officers, community leaders, even media outlets were present. The theme was restoring trust. As Malik took the stage, a familiar face sat quietly in the back row. Officer Tyler Reynolds. He hadn't come to be seen. He came to listen, the way he had learned to. Malik spoke with his usual poise. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about growth. And trust isn't built by fear, it's built by listening. I've seen the damage of unchecked authority, but I've also seen redemption, when people are willing to look inward. He paused. Someone once mocked me on the side of the road, not knowing who I was. That same person later stood before me, not as an officer, but as a human being asking for accountability. The audience was still. I didn't forgive him because of his apology. I gave him space to change because I believed he could. And from what I've seen, I wasn't wrong. Reynolds felt his chest tighten. For the first time since that day, he smiled, not from relief, but from pride. After the event, he waited near the exit. As Malik walked past, their eyes met. Reynolds extended a hand. "Still listening, Your Honor." Malik shook it. "Then keep listening. And keep leading. No cameras. No applause. Just two men, once strangers on opposite sides of a roadside stop, now linked by something far deeper than a courtroom. A moment of change. A lesson lived. A circle completed. A year had passed since that fateful morning on the highway. Officer Tyler Reynolds was no longer just another name in the department, he had quietly become a model of reform. He'd started mentoring new recruits, emphasizing de-escalation, empathy, and self-awareness. During every training, he told them the story, not from the perspective of a cop who got caught, but of a man who almost missed the point entirely. At the police academy's annual graduation, he was asked to deliver the keynote speech. He opened with this: "I thought I wore the badge to enforce the law. Then I met someone who taught me the law was more than words, it was how you made people feel when you held the power. He didn't name Judge Malik Thomas. He didn't have to. The lesson spoke louder than the event. Meanwhile, Judge Thomas continued his work on the bench, presiding with fairness, dignity, and the kind of integrity that never needed to announce itself. One day, while visiting a youth mentorship center, he noticed a mural on the wall. It showed a police officer sitting beside a young boy, handing him a book instead of a ticket. Beneath it was a quote. "The strongest change begins with a conversation." Malik smiled quietly. The legacy wasn't his alone. But it had started with one conversation on the side of a road. One moment when someone could have stayed defensive, and instead chose reflection. That was the power of grace. And that was how justice echoed far beyond the courtroom, into classrooms, into precincts, into lives. 2 years after that early morning encounter, something unexpected happened. A national journalism outlet published an investigative story titled "The Stop That Sparked Reform." It told the quiet but powerful journey of a judge and an officer, two men who could have been enemies, but instead became symbols of something rare in modern America: accountability without vengeance. Authority with humility. Redemption through choice. The story went viral. It wasn't filled with outrage. It wasn't scandalous. It was honest. And people were hungry for that. Police departments across the country reached out to implement community listening sessions modeled after the one Reynolds had attended. The idea wasn't to punish officers, it was to humanize the job again. To bring officers and citizens together not in conflict, but in dialogue. Judge Malik Thomas was invited to speak before Congress. His words were direct but calm: "We don't need louder punishments. We need deeper accountability. And we need leaders who are brave enough to admit when they got it wrong, because that's where the real change begins." Sitting quietly in the audience was Reynolds. He didn't wear his badge that day. He didn't need to. After the hearing, the two men met in the hallway, now familiar, no longer judge and officer, but allies in a movement bigger than either of them. Reynolds extended a hand. This time, Malik pulled him into a quiet embrace instead. "You didn't just fix a mistake," the judge said. "You started a wave." And just like that, the story that began on a quiet highway, was now moving across cities, departments, and hearts. Because sometimes the most powerful reforms don't start with laws, they start with a reckoning. And at Choice Point 3 years later, Judge Malik Thomas sat on a National Judicial Ethics Board, the highest oversight body for the federal bench. His reputation was legendary, not because of how many rulings he issued, but because of how many lives he impacted beyond the courtroom. Meanwhile, Officer Tyler Reynolds, now Sergeant Reynolds, was running a statewide police mentorship initiative. The program focused on empathy-based leadership, especially for officers entering high-stress urban environments. And at every seminar, he still told his story, not proudly, but truthfully. One day, their paths crossed again at a joint conference on justice reform. This time, they weren't guest and listener. They were co-panelists. Malik opened the discussion. "I once said that accountability starts conversations. But what I've learned since then, is that it also builds bridges, the kind that can carry a broken system into something stronger." When it was Reynolds' turn, he spoke plainly. "I was trained to enforce. But I was never trained to reflect. Judge Thomas didn't just correct me. He challenged me to become a better version of the man I thought I already was." The room stood in silence. Then applause. Not because of drama. Not because of scandal. But because two people had proven something rare: true power isn't in control. It's in restraint. It's in listening. It's in grace. That night, Malik walked out of the auditorium and stood beneath the quiet sky. A young law student approached him, notebook in hand. "Sir," she asked softly, "what made you give him a second chance back then?" Malik looked her in the eye. "Because justice without compassion is just vengeance in disguise." And the world already has enough of that. He smiled, tipped his head politely, and walked into the night. And the student, like many others before her, now carried a story that wasn't just about a traffic stop, but about a turning point.